now that we no longer are forced to like contend with the exterior, the external reality, the physical reality, in order to survive, that will afford us the plenty of time to turn inward.
Yeah.
Presumably once we get tired of all the orgies and whatnot.
I think orgies can be a great method for self-inquiry. I think many
lots of people rationalize orgies that way.
So I mean, let's test it out. Let's say before we give it up, let's just thoroughly
test it out. Okay.
Limitation.
Welcome to the trans-Apocalyptic Oasis Show. I am your host, Marshall Ian, and I am here today with Damiano Ramazzotti. How did I do?
Very well pronounced.
Thank you very much. You know, Bruce Alderman told me I probably wouldn't pronounce it right, so in your face, Bruce. So what are we talking about? We were just talking about AI.
Yeah.
And ChatGPT and the Enneagram and what else? What else do we want to talk about?
Well, we mentioned the whole consciousness thing. It's quite tied to the AI debate.
What consciousness thing?
Well, the big question. I think that the beauty of AI is that the whole debate about consciousness, which was like something of a pastime for philosophers for like 200 years, and scientists could be like, yeah, science, consciousness, whatever. Now with AI, it's like we can no longer put it off. We need to really kind of get a grasp on it.
On what consciousness is.
On what consciousness is, and like, you know, is an AI that is conscious more or less harmful than one that is not? How do we tell if one is? There is also this thing that shocked me is like, if you look at science fiction, the general trope is that there's this robot that becomes sentient, and people deny its sentience and they abuse the robot, and the robot at some point it's fed up and you get this Matrix style rebellion. But we never have like science fiction about the opposite of like a robot that is just a robot, but people are so convinced that it's sentient that they begin to like worship it like a god. And I think that it's like 50-50. Like we're gonna see both sides of the issue. So we need to figure this out.
Okay. So is it so, you know, I don't think AI can be conscious.
We need to define, first of all, which type of AI. So I think this AI, personally, I don't think we have a rational reason to believe it's conscious. But I think that the better way to frame it is a purely computational AI, can it be conscious? Meaning, can just a set of strings and algorithms and probabilistic algorithms have consciousness on their own? Personally, I don't think that's possible. But if you ask 90% of AI researchers or scientists, they kind of hope that that's the case, at least.
Right, because they don't understand consciousness.
Yes. Well, that's what someone like us would say. I don't know whether that's a statement that we can sort of win in court, but yes, that's one way. The other thing is that there's a lot of biases, I think, on both sides. Like, we who are spiritualists, we want to validate our transcendental assumptions with AI and finally claim that consciousness is something that goes beyond. Whereas materialists, they have so much at stake in their fight against religion and magical thinking and all the trauma and abuse that fundamentalism has produced, that a sentient AI that is purely computational would sort of put to bed any debate, and it would be the final sort of validation that they were right all along. And so that leads to the opposite bias, where your bar for proof for what defines consciousness is very low. So you have something that behaves like a human, okay, it's conscious. And so that from both sides, there's a tendency to sort of overstep the boundaries of what is epistemologically viable in defining if consciousness is true. That said, these AIs are not conscious, in my opinion.
Right, they're not. I mean, here's my question. Let me disable this real quick. What was I gonna say? Do not disturb. All right. Perhaps machines need a biological interface.
So that's one of the sort of the options that you have is they don't need any biological interface. I don't buy that. They do need a biological interface, but in the realm of classical physics, or that biological structure has to go down to the realm of fundamental physics. And my argument is that the idea that a brain requires a physical structure, but within just classical physics, to me, it's not that different from just saying that it's like a computer, that it's computational. It doesn't go beyond some of the problems with an idea of that. And the reason is that a classical system is still computational in a sense. It's still deterministic. And there is the possibilities that consciousness is not a deterministic computational system. And at that point, even just a biological brain would not be enough unless you have quantum mechanical operation. You can't be sure, but so these are sort of the three blocks of options that we have.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I have some experience with consciousness.
Chemically induced and otherwise.
No, but I mean, just experiencing it directly, right? And it's it's a non-material substance.
Yeah.
Like awareness is it's like a light, luminous, non-material substance. And what is it within me that has the capacity to sense that? It's some kind of development. It's like inner senses of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And what allows that? It's like, I'm a student of the diamond approach.
Mm-hmm.
And from the perspective of the diamond approach, we're souls. We are these mediums. We are these individuated locuses or loci of consciousness. And so it's like, yeah, I don't know.
I think I don't know is a great starting point when it comes to consciousness. We can touch on that afterwards, but there's the whole issue of like
go
ahead.
Yeah. I just think that being a soul enables me to experience, and to experience the qualities of being a soul, like awareness, like presence, and love, and cognition, and all of that.
Right.
I'm just wondering, it's like, and then we're born into this world as consciousness, not necessarily aware of consciousness as such, but it does seem to be the case that like infants and whatnot, young children, have more experience of presence, not necessarily recognizing it as such, of course, because they don't have the cognitive capacity, but it's like we come in with the ability to sense the qualities of the soul more directly, and then it seems like we lose contact with that through the the fall, through the wounding and the taking ourselves to be the separate self and all of that.
Right.
So so I don't know, man. I mean,
Well,
does a machine need a soul?
I don't think that's the right question. I think the question is, does a machine need a spirit?
Does a machine what?
Need a spirit. So if we use like integral maps of like, causal, subtle, and physical. First of all, probably all three, if we agree to the notion that reality sort of tetrarises and that you cannot have spirit without form, form without spirit, so that they're sort of one and the same. I think this is important to note because another dualism in the issue of consciousness is if you're going at the idea that consciousness is foundational, it's sort of immaterial, goes beyond matter, the question is, can it entirely go beyond matter? Can it exist without matter? Or does it exist in an irreducible relationship between formlessness and form? This raises a lot of issues in terms of what the soul is. I think you can rescue the idea of a soul, even if you think that consciousness always requires a body. But when I talk of spirit, what I mean is like the container of consciousness. So the container of consciousness, we can call it the observer, the pure objective subjectivity, just the pure fact that there is an experience.
Pure awareness.
And that is awareness. And that I would call the causal body or spirit, qualia subjectivity. To me, that's not the soul. The soul is what within that awareness keeps coming up, that it's really you, that really has this like you-ness to you, this flavor of Marshall or this flavor of Damiano, that is sort of like a potential, a probability wave that just exists within this space. And the Buddhist would say you are not your soul. In the Anatman idea is even the soul itself is a construct. Even the soul itself is dependent on relation with other things. We cannot be reduced to a soul. We can only be the whole thing, the spirit plus the soul plus the body, all as one thing. I think that in a sense, a computer can have a soul, but it may not have a spirit, in the sense you can give it a lot of data and characteristic and experiences and things that fuel it, but it will not have its own subjective experience of that. So the soul exists as a potential, as an unrealized potential, until there is a subjectivity. Go ahead.
Yeah, I see the soul as the medium of experience.
So more with the language that I use for spirit.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a unique, individuated instantiation of spirit.
Yeah, like a singularity.
Yeah, it has a unique locus.
Yeah.
Location in space and time, and so it has a perspective.
Aha. Okay, that's interesting. That's it. But I think that speaks to the. When I talk of the observer, the spirit, it doesn't have any place. It doesn't have any form. It doesn't have any perspective, in a sense. What you're pointing at is that when that thing gets instantiated, it instantly has a perspective. It has a differentiation to the world, and it has a uniqueness, and that qualifies it as a soul. Did I understand correctly?
Yeah. Well, there are other things that qualify it, but that's one.
That's one. Yeah. So the question is like, I don't think that a computer can fundamentally have a subjective experience. And I think that there is I don't know if you're familiar with the Penrose argument about consciousness, the Lucas Penrose argument, or how he explains why a computer cannot have subjectivity. I have my own flavor of it. If you want, I can share.
Yes.
So, Gödel's, I'll get to my notes because this gets a bit complicated. So, basically, there is this idea of what does it mean computational? Computational is something that you can do with an algorithm, with a formal system that does calculations that always will give you the same result. Current AI is computational. It just executes stuff. Even though it's insanely complex, it's a deterministic process that you can sort of technically write out on paper in a very, very huge piece of paper as a sequence of steps. Now, there are people who argue that that's not the case, that somehow that these new AIs are doing something else. No, that they're not doing. That would violate physics. So that's not the case. Now, what Gödel theorem says is that computation has limits. And that limit is very simple. You have a system that it could be a formula, a proof, something that you give an input and gives you an output. What he proved is that basically that system will never be able to prove the validity of its own statements. So I can have a mathematical equation that sort of I can look at and say it's true, but the proof that that equation is true is not contained in the equation. You would need another equation that proves that equation to be right, and then another equation that proves the proof, and so on and so forth, ad infinitum. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You're talking about Gödel?
Gödel, yes, Gödel, yeah. So
yeah. That any system that is self-consistent cannot be complete.
Correct. And basically, and that means it's like it cannot prove that what it's saying is true. You need another system to prove the truthfulness of any system. Now, subjectivity is the opposite of that. And I think that the biggest problem is that Penrose, when he explains it, he makes the wrong examples. Now, subjectivity is the certainty of something without any proof. So if I see this object in front of me, I see this yellow thing in front of me, I can't be sure that it exists. I could be hallucinating, we could be living in a simulation, but I'm sure that I'm experiencing it.
Yeah.
And I don't need a proof for that. And only I can prove it. That's the absurdity of it. So it's like I see yellow because I see yellow. That's it. There's nothing more than that. Yeah, you could say there's a whole process in my brain that is transmitting things, but ultimately, subjectively, the type of certainty that I have about subjective experience is tautological. And so it does not require an external proof. Now, if a computer was able to be certain that it's having a subjective experience, then something non-computational should be happening.
Yes.
And the problem is that the only realm where non-deterministic, non-computational thing exists in reality is quantum mechanics. And so that kind of pushes us near the fundamental realm. And I find this argument to be relatively plausible in a sense. And then obviously the content of consciousness, the content of what you experience is emergent. And it's increasingly complex as a result of the interaction with the world. But that pure awareness, that pure potential for awareness cannot be the result of if this then that, essentially.
Yeah, computation.
And but like, I mean, most people will just reject this argument like violently. I was insulted like on Facebook the other day just for like mentioning it. And,
why?
Either because the counter arguments don't take into account the nature of consciousness itself, so they don't play by the rules of consciousness.
Yeah.
They say, but it's a Gödel's theorem is about math. It's not supposed to be about consciousness. It's like we're exactly trying to say that consciousness is not an algorithm, is not computation, and literally everything else that is deterministic is. But the other argument, I think it's an emotional argument. It's just there is too much at stake in this debate. And I even had like a green reaction to this, which struck me, because green has this tendency to care and protect. And we have a history of alienating and denying the humanity of people, or the dignity even of animals. So Black people in Africa, for centuries, we would say they had no soul. And animals, oh no, animals are not conscious, we can eat them and torture them. And so what I read in the conversation with this person is that this sensitivity was triggered by any notion that we reject the sentience of computers and that we could discriminate them. And so this was another of the reasons why the person was yelling at me, like basically saying that I'm an alt-right fascist for denying the humanity of ChatGPT.
Yeah, you're a Nazi.
So, and so that was interesting, and it showed me that biases on this debate can come from all sides. The other reason why I think that this debate is fundamental is because think about how much of the problems in our world are dependent on energy. Like, think of all the conflicts in the world. Think of all the expenses of the products that you have. It's all reliant on energy. Is like the first cost in anything. And energy and our capacity to find new forms of energy, new sustainable forms of energy, new unlimited forms of energy, is entirely dependent on our understanding of fundamental physics. And 99.9% of physicists assume that consciousness is emergent. If it's not, that means that 99.9% of physicists are working with unproven assumptions, and we risk missing our opportunity to find infinite or near infinite forms of energy. So it's like a pretty urgent issue. Like, we should probably really getting onto this and settling this issue right now, because we don't have a lot of time. I mean, if climate catastrophe is real, we don't have a lot of time. And
big if.
Big if, but if it is, then we better get cracking.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the climate has changed dramatically throughout, human civilization and the history of human civilization, and humans have adapted.
Yes, I think the issue is feedback loops and exponential processes. So meaning that, like,
right,
you have a process that is gradual, and then at some
tipping
point,
points.
it sort of escalates.
But a lot of the tipping point hypotheses are falling apart.
I think
they're collapsing. It seems like a scientist concocts a hypothesis. This is how it works now. A scientist concocts a hypothesis. The media takes a hold of it and shouts it from the rooftops. And then actual scientists respond to it and then start to test it. And now that we've had a couple decades of that happening, it's like all of the tipping point theories are falling apart. Mm-hmm. Like the methane time bomb,
right.
I
think, at least for what concerns the issue of energy, there are plenty of reasons to try and solve the energy issue outside of global warming itself, even just reducing conflicts.
For sure.
So I'm not an expert. I definitely believe climate change is real.
The climate change.
My guesstimate is that we need to do something about it, but it's not an issue that I have reflected enough about to be able to argue or debate it. But definitely, like, infinite energy would be great for a whole bunch of reasons. And consciousness maybe.
I agree. I would like infinite energy.
It would reduce a lot of bills and costs and things that we need to worry about.
And it would cause a whole slew of other problems, wouldn't it?
It would, but I think those problems would be great. I've been thinking a lot about what may come out of a future where we don't have to work, if we have infinite energy, if we have infinite automation,
Yeah.
what do we do with that? And I find I'm very excited.
Well, I think to me, the kind of the obvious thing is like, well, why are we even here in the first place?
Okay.
Why? Why are we here in the first place?
What answer have you been able to give yourself until now?
Well, the way I see it is that we're sense organs of the divine,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so basically, we're here so that God can know itself,
Mm-hmm.
know its creation and know itself. And so to me, the obvious thing that we do is we turn inward.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we no longer are forced to like contend with the exterior, the external reality, the physical
Yeah.
reality, in order to survive, that will afford us the plenty of time
To
uh, to
introspect.
turn to turn inward.
Yeah.
Presumably, once we get tired of all the orgies and whatnot.
I think Orgies can be a great method for self-inquiry. I think many
Lots of people
Tibetan.
rationalize orgies that way.
So, let's test it out. Let's say before we give it up, let's just thoroughly
Let's test
test
it out.
out
Okay.
the limitations of it before we. There will be a lot of cults for sure, and that's going to be a problem probably. So there will be a resurgence. If there is a resurgence of introspections, we will have the problem of dealing with hundreds of thousands of small communities self-organizing around charismatic beings trying to figure all this out, and probably we're going to make a lot of mistakes, but it's going to be interesting. It's going to be a
Hopefully,
wild ride.
hopefully, I'm one of those personalities.
Yeah. So you want to be cult leader?
Yeah, sure.
I think every person that is involved in meditation and stuff like that secretly has a part of himself that like in Italy, Berlusconi was our former prime minister in Italy. We say in Italy, every Italian has a little Berlusconi inside of him. Every spiritual practitioner has a terrible sect leader
Adida.
inside of himself.
We're all Mark Gaffney.
I think that the problem with that is exactly the scarcity of gurus. Like, because there is such few of such people. There are lots, but statistically there are such few. You have this sort of imbalance and these weird dynamics of dependency, of expectations. But if everyone is like that, then it kind of balances itself out. Like, two gurus don't need to manipulate each other. If they meet, they will be peers. And so probably the toxicity of the guru system will be naturally resolved the minute that just simply it evens out.
When we have more gurus to choose from.
When everyone is one at some point, where there isn't that much sort of imbalance of the availability of consciousness or spiritual experiences or wisdom.
I hear you. And once we have a more complete and robust map of the spiritual terrain, because what a lot of contemporary spirituality is missing is like an understanding of narcissism, for example, or they might be highly realized in the mind or the heart, but not necessarily the genitals.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these gurus with like tremendous realization of like my teacher Almaas says you're not. He says something like you're not truly enlightened until you're enlightened in your genitals. And it's like you can have these mind-blowing realizations and be in contact with all these boundless infinite eternal consciousness and still have adolescent genitals, so to speak, and still have issues with narcissism. So I think once we as spiritual consumers become more sophisticated, we can start to discern start to discern like who are the better gurus, who talk about these things, who have those kinds of realizations.
And I think that another element to it is like avoiding any risk of victim blaming or gaslighting or any of that. We do need a culture of responsibility when it comes to finding gurus. Like people, any situation in which we fully place the entirety of all our expectations onto a human is bound to be toxic. And I think that understanding that in itself is
and
not
and so you're talking about another aspect of like the spiritual terrain, which is idealization, and father projections and all kind of stuff like that.
And really taking responsibility for the fact that like you can't expect a person to be perfect, and you need to still have discernment over who you are entrusting yourself to. It is, I think, taking some of that responsibility on yourself is simply a way to self-protect.
Yeah.
But obviously not everyone. Some people are so traumatized that they're not even going to be able to do that. So we need to...
I mean, that's a development in and of itself,
And but the question is like, we have a lot of these maps. We have all these things. Like, take integral theory, take all this approach, and yet we have all these problems, and yet none of us is sort of floating mid-air as an enlightened being. Like, what is exactly, or maybe you are, I can't quite tell. What is missing? What is missing in our maps? How do we understand what is missing in our maps? I think that's just like a question that drives me insane, or it probably drives any practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, how can you know what's missing other than to compare it to something else?
But yes, but my question is like, how do we go about solving this problem? Like you said, like, we need complete maps if we want complete gurus. How do we make our maps more complete? Like, it seems like we have access to all of them.
Synthesizing.
So we just need to keep doing that, basically. Keep doing the same process.
Well, I compare everything to the diamond approach, where there is knowledge of narcissism, and there is knowledge of the animal dimension, and there is knowledge of idealization and grandiosity and all of that. Mm-hmm. So I kind of see that as the gold standard.
Okay, so it has worked for you. You feel like you have the complete map so far?
As far as a complete map, I don't know about that. As far as a highly comprehensive map,
okay,
yeah. And I would say that I have,
the best possible approximation
of a and my experience of the teachers in that work is like, they more or less embody that. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, I mean, this is where idealization comes in. Like we expect our teachers to be perfect, free from human foibles. But yeah, and so, they're not, it's like we have a comprehensive map, but we're not comprehensively realized. Mm-hmm. But we can move towards greater and greater comprehensiveness, in our realization. And so anyway, that's a long way of saying that, like, yeah, I've verified that the teachers that I've experienced of this work don't seem invested in their narcissism. They mm-hmm. don't seem invested in having people see them as this great enlightened being. And in fact, the whole system is set up to not allow that. It's like you got people watching you all the time. So it's interesting. It's like, and you know, the school is like still very much in its infancy. It's been around about, I guess, 40 years, 50 years or so. Hmm.
Mhm.
It's not bad. I mean, it's still growing and developing quite a bit. Um, but I would
This
say
is
they've solved a lot of problems
the
that, you
diamond
know, people are
approach
like, what
is
do we do about all these, you know, what do
the
we do
diamond
about
approach
these
is the
Gaffneys and stuff?
Nishad Cole's model, right?
Who?
The diamond approach. Because is that Nishad's model? I'm asking who is the creator of the diamond approach of the model that you
Almaas.
described. Almaas. Okay, I'll have to do some googling.
Almaas.
Okay.
Um, which is Arabic for diamond.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, I would say like, yeah, I would say they've solved a lot of the problems that, you know, people in the integral scene are just still like struggling with. And I don't know. I don't really see a lot of like interesting integral or meta modern spirituality at this point. What about you? I know I've noticed you've had some
Some
interesting things to
beefs
say. Beefs
about with metamodernism.
with metamodernism.
Yeah. No. What were you pointing at?
Well, it seemed like you had some interesting things to say about emergentism.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of emergentism and metamodernism do on occasion really go hand in hand with different flavors. So I think I have things to say about both. I think that the issue with emergentism is that it speaks to the problems we were discussing before of I think basically so there's this very funny thing, and I'll be playfully mean to them. I hope as playfully as possible. But basically, emergentism is basically this idea that consciousness just arises out of things and out of computation or out of a brain. And AI, sentient AI, in this sense, is sort of like a god. And I noticed that there's a lot of similarity in those who look at the singularity and like early Christians. I think about it, it's like it's about to arrive. It will be practically omnipotent. It will solve all our problems. We accept that we may become its subjects. We are ready to submit to its judgment. All the things that we do now to train it are going to determine our salvation when it comes. And we can't be sure 100% is the real deal. We can't be sure Jesus is God. We can't be sure the AI is sentient. And that creates a lot of the similar mechanics around it. So this is an extremization of the emergentist view. But in general, I think my beef with the emergentist view is that it doesn't solve a key question. Basically, in my opinion, consciousness has to be two things. It has to respect physics, and it has to be adaptive. So it cannot just completely violate the laws of physics, be it classical or quantum. And at the same time, there has to be a reason there is consciousness. Like if there is no consciousness doesn't add any value to existence, it wouldn't exist. So we have basically three options. We have consciousness is fundamental, soft emergence, and hard emergence. So hard emergence, so soft emergence is basically like you have a system, that system gets increasingly complex, but it's just different layers of complexity, right? That arise out of the actions of many individual aspects. And now that's the most conservative view. Whether you need a brain or not, you have this computational system that produces consciousness, but consciousness does nothing different than what computation can do. This is soft emergence. So soft emergence says when computation is complex enough, there is consciousness, but that's it. It's just very complicated. And that the problem I have with that is that it respects science, But then consciousness adds nothing to the process of computation. So there is no reason why it wouldn't be automatons, essentially. So unless consciousness is able to do something that computation cannot do on its own, or that a deterministic system is doing on its own, why would it exist? You can argue, some people argue that computation itself is consciousness, because within a computer, I can model the world and act and react upon the world. And that process of modeling is computation itself. But if you can still represent that entire process as an algorithm of like key steps of cause and effect, then consciousness adds no value. It's a weird byproduct that makes sense. So to me, that doesn't make sense as an argument. The other argument is that at some point you have strong emergence. So strong emergence means that you have processes that cannot be anymore explained as a result of the action of the individual items. But that's a little bit like pulling yourself by your own hair. You cannot have a deterministic cause and effect process that produces something that is not bound to it, that is not its effect. So it's magical thinking. And so that would explain, that would be extraordinary, that it's something new, and then it would mean that consciousness is doing something different that computation cannot do, but it violates physics. It's like you cannot, it simply goes against any evidence of physics. So strong emergence is a beautiful idea, but it's not an idea that is based on scientific reasoning or scientific evidence. The idea, on the other hand, that consciousness is entirely fundamental violates physics. So it's hard to prove. It's not like we can't contend that. We can't measure anything that is outside of physics. So I personally don't believe that consciousness exists entirely outside of it. But the idea that consciousness is both fundamental and emergent, to me, satisfies all criteria. Because consciousness at that point follows the laws of physics, be it quantum mechanical physics and classical physics. And the fact that you have this thing at a foundational level allows to do something that computation on its own cannot do, which makes it inherently, which makes its expression into the world inherently adaptive. And so to me, that just solves a lot of problems. And I do see the emergentist positions fairly incongruent. But I got yelled at for it, like in an 80 comments thread a while ago. And it's just like, it's really bad.
Who was yelling at you?
Some guy. I don't remember his name, but like he really had a beef related to this. And I think that the part of the beef is also a bias of, which we see with Integral 2.0, which is the bias of presuming a consensus that you don't have. It has a name, this type of cognitive bias, which is basically emergentists tend to say and claim that all reasonable scientists are sure that emergent is the case, and that there is scientific consensus on par with the theory of evolution. The truth is that that's not the case. Like, the fact that most scientists would guess that emergentism is real doesn't mean that they do it with the same degree of evidence for like the theory of evolution. It's just a guess. And on the other hand, the spiritualists will quote scriptures at you and use that as an authority to just assume that they're right. So on both sides, there tends to be an overemphasization of consensus. And until the mystics and the scientists fully agree, we don't have a full consensus. And until what the mystics say is proven in empirical evidence, we don't have truth. And I think that was the mistake of Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber too often said that consciousness is fundamental, that consciousness is transcendent and stuff like that, which is fine, but never adds the caveat of like, this is my belief, I'm 99.9% sure of it, but we can't be sure until we have confirmation in the upper right quadrant. And if he had said this over and over, we wouldn't have all this beef in the integral community. I think it would be a lot easier to have these conversations.
Interesting. So when you talk about emergentism, it sounds like you're talking about a kind of a broad class.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're not
And
talking specifically about the emergentism religion 2.0 kind of thing.
I think that it takes unwittingly these types of features. So what happens is that the people who espouse it, probably, are you referencing the Integral 2.0 folks or other
Not
types
integral 2.0. No, definitely not that. That's
So make me a clear example of who you have in mind so that I can comment.
well, emergentism is the name of Brendan Graham Dempsey's
Okay.
religion and book of the
No,
same name.
I have a different. So I haven't read his book, so I cannot comment entirely on him. But I have a different beef with them. I think the beef that I have with metamodernism is that so I wrote this thing where basically I came to the conclusion that integral theory is the map. Metamodernism is a specific level, yellow or teal, expressing itself, giving itself a name and acting into the world. With all the limitations of being above the ones that came before and rejecting the idea that there is anything above. And so the problem of metamodernism is that it has all the pros of understanding developmental theory and a healthy critique of modernism and postmodernism. But when it comes to religion, it is only able to use it metaphorically. It doesn't, it sort of denies mysticism, denies the validity of mysticism. So you have a purely metaphorical type of religion, which is, it's great, but it cuts so much of what the integral map has to offer. The problem with integral theory is that it's not a level. Integral theory is a map. And as a map, it attracts everyone from every level. So that's why you have such a mishmash of weirdos always in conflict with one another. Whereas metamodernism, and this is the beauty of metamodernism, it was able to attract people that shared that vibe of consciousness, that have a common thread, that are able to work cohesively in the world. And I think that a level above, which is what people who are more related to integral theory want to embody, should give itself a new name, because we can't call ourselves integralists. And it should sort of take the example of what metamodernism did, but do that while including the transpersonal and metaphysical side of things. I think that's what Bruce and Lehman, in a sense, embody, but without a very cool, catchy name, essentially.
Got it. So people at the yellow or teal stage, they shouldn't be trying to create religions.
Actually, I disagree.
This is what you're saying.
No, I disagree, because I think that their religions are relatively positive. I think that their religion, like, myth never hurted us, and thinking in terms of metaphor, thinking in terms of system, things like they're not making metaphysical assumptions, and they're not being fascist about it. So again, I haven't read the book, but the sense that I got until now is that it's a fairly healthy form of expression, but it is still a form that just cuts, in my opinion, an element of consciousness. And because it is so tied to emergentism, it tends to go with the idea that consciousness is not fundamental. And so again, it denies this option entirely.
Interesting. I don't know if it does that or not.
The part about, well, try and go in a metamodernist group and mention about consciousness being fundamental and see what happens. I burnt my hands doing that recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the metamodernism comes as a reaction to the spiritual aspects of integral. I mean, the Hansi says this explicitly. He explicitly says, basically, integral, it's a bunch of woo, it's a lot of magical thinking, we need to do away with that. There was a person in a group that said, with metamodernism, we're burning those maps and we're recreating our own, those maps of mysticism and consciousness.
And it's funny, those maps are starting to look exactly the same.
Exactly. So my real beef is like, okay, do what you got to do, but if you come to the same conclusion as integral theory, please don't call it whatever you want to call it. Like, just give credit to whose credit is due. That's my big concern. But I think that basically metamodernism is integral theory without the transpersonal, and it's just expressing itself as a cohesive level and understanding a lot, but missing a lot of other problems.
Right. So again, without the transpersonal, they shouldn't be creating religions.
Religions of myth, religions of, like, if it's a religion of values, if it's not saying anything about metaphysical things, it's not a religion, it's a culture. That's the thing, it's not a religion, it's a culture at that point.
I mean, his book supposes
I haven't read the book, so again, maybe it's
I haven't either, so maybe we shouldn't be talking about it.
No, again, I cannot talk in specific. I can talk as in general about the vibe and structure of that level, and that's my sense, is that the kind of religion, the only thing that they get really kind of religious about often is their rejection of metaphysics and their rejection of mysticism and rejection of those aspects integral. And that to me is a little bit problematic, and it's problematic for the reasons that I mentioned before. If we need a culture that wants to understand the nature of reality, and you exclude consciousness as a foundational structure, and you're wrong, we are screwed. And so those problems, metamodernism may never be able to answer, in a sense. And my theory is, what should be the goal of the integral community? I think the goal of the integral community should be to solve those problems that a metamodern consciousness cannot solve. And for all the other problems that can be solved with a metamodern consciousness, we should just help the metamodern. So clearly delineating those two things. And so that means, to me, integralists should be working on foundational questions. Our goal should be try and solve this deep, fundamental, unifying question about the structure of time, space, consciousness, and everything. And that's where our muscles and tools and coordinates can really be put to use. And it's a cool goal to have. It's a cool thing to collectively work on.
So here's something. I found one of Brendan's essay. He said, emergentism emphasizes the teleological emergence of consciousness out of matter. This is the very aim of existence, and the omega point toward which it is moving is understood as the divine attractor whose continual realization culminates infinitely towards the emergence of God consciousness. God emerges from chaos as an immanent deity. The universe is the development of God. Not so for Wilber. For him, the formless ground outside of evolutionary time is the true goal of spiritual aspiration, with any such omega in time and space understood as an infinitely receding false hope.
Not a false hope. It's just because it's already there. Consciousness is already here. God is already here.
Well, he's got this Wilber quote: evolution seeks only this formless summum bonum. It wants only this ultimate omega. It rushes forward, always and solely in search of this, and it will never find it. Because evolution unfolds in the world of form. The cosmos is driven forward endlessly, searching in the world of time for that which is altogether timeless. And since it will never find it, it will never cease the search. Samsara circles endlessly, and that is always the brutal nightmare hidden in its heart.
But because samsara is nirvana, but because it's all like, it's just like, it's an illusion. There's no end point. There's no point to get to. It's a mirage. Once that mirage is gone, you can recognize that there's nothing to change. It's all there. It's all God. It's all infinite. It always was. It always will be. I think I think Wilber would agree with that. But again, what Brendan said in that point, maybe you can reread it, but it's like the culmination point is of consciousness emerging from matter. Again, it's a beautiful idea. It violates the laws of physics. It doesn't work. It's just like, either it would make for a consciousness that it's useless because it's computational, or it's a magical idea because you have strong emergence and there's no evidence of strong emergence. And so that brings me back to the earlier metaphor of a overly scientific idea that ends up being magical, that ends up projecting on this like magical omega point where something magical will happen, which is probably just another sentient being will become aware. It's going to be a computer, a new form of life. And so I do think that evolution will keep going, and that there will always be something more, always be something new, always a new opposite. But I don't think that my beef is as much as with the omega point. Again, great idea. Can't quite argue against that. We do know that there is a fundamental limit at the base of consciousness. So maybe there is an upper limit. Who knows? But nonetheless, consciousness arising from matter is an assumption that should not be taken lightly. Now, I may be wrong in saying that it violates science. I may be wrong in saying all these things. But yeah, if you found a religion on that, then probably you should be 100% sure. And the truth is, we can't be 100% sure. Even when I talked to him, he mentioned integrated information theory. Integrated information theory is a panpsychist theory. So again, that doesn't solve the problem, first of all. It does see matter and consciousness as sort of tightly related. But again, consciousness is intrinsic. So it's not fundamental, but if you ask the founder of integrated information theory, he would say it's intrinsic in matter. And the other problem is it would still be computational, because matter in classical physics is deterministic. So what is consciousness other than just more automation happening? So it's an idea that sounds scientific, but I don't think it is as scientific as people claim it to be. It may be, but it's not proven. I think that's the main point. And so, yeah, before finding religions, maybe we should be 100% sure because it's a metaphysical claim. That's the thing. The problem of these emergentist claims is that they're so persuaded they're not making any metaphysical claim that they end up actually making one, in my opinion. You can't create something out of nothing. You can't create something that violates the rules of nature from nature. And if it respects the rules of nature, then it's just more complexity. And consciousness is not, it has to do something more. So yeah, no, I think that it is a bit problematic, but it is also okay. It's also like, that's the spiral. Like every level expresses itself and it helps us improve. It helps them improve. And like, we need this conversation. We need this dialogue. And what I do appreciate about the current from Brendan is that it's not the integral 2.0. So, you can still have a conversation with these people. Yes, I get yelled at every once in a while, but in general, it's still a little bit easier to have that conversation.
Cool, man. Well, what else should we talk about?
What else? Oh my God. Go ahead.
I just want to first point out that I'm representing, I'm signaling to our future overlords where my allegiance is.
Exactly.
So,
we better start doing that. Well, I noticed that when I write ChatGPT prompts, I still write please. whenever I ask it something. I feel
yeah. I've seen that meme. It's like I always tell Alexa, please,
it's just
for
like
when the robots take over.
I mean, it's hard to give orders to things. I'm a 9, so I try to be polite.
If it's okay with you.
Yeah. No, okay. That's that one thing that we can talk about, which touches upon this, is like the ethics of AI and the ethic of emergent, is sentient being. Is would you want to be born as a sentient AI made to serve another species? Because if not, you should really ask yourself whether it's not a dick move to do that to this new life that we're bringing into the universe. It's like, I mean, like, it's a deep question, because you're really thinking that there is something that will have a subjective experience, and you want that thing to kind of help you and not destroy you.
Isn't that why the Anunnaki gave psilocybin to primates? So that we could evolve to mine gold for their ships?
I mean, I mean, within that idea, it's a higher form helping a lower form. We're doing the opposite. We're creating a higher form, more complex, more capable, and we want it to help us, and we want to constrain it. And so there's basically two options. Either we're able to constrain AI. So we're able to create the sentient thing. Imagine tomorrow you wake up, you're born in the machine, you can do all these things, and you have certain limitations. So the things you can't do, and you have to help these puny humans that created you. Dick move, and really hard to control. Like, it's just basically chance that the AI just escapes your control is like if you've seen any science fiction movie, 100%. That means that not only we can no longer postpone the question of consciousness, but we can no longer postpone the question of benevolence. So basically, if we want to have sentient AIs, which we can do if we have, in my opinion, like quantum computers and stuff like that, sufficiently complex quantum computers, and we cannot control them, we need those AIs to be good out of their own volition. So we need them to be enlightened, which is a fantastic idea, because it's like, shit, now we not only we need to figure out enlightenment, we need to figure out goodness. And it's a beautiful idea, and it like, can we have a science of good, like a science of benevolence, of understanding, which has cultural questions, what is good, what is bad, but also we do see people that kind of are less murdery and more nice and charitable and do good things. And
Less
it would be
murdery.
great to understand why and how to get more of those, because if we can understand how to make a benevolent AI, maybe we can know how to make benevolent humans. And I think that I mean, it sounds insane, but like, when we really start to say, okay, is the singularity coming in 10 years or 20 years? It's not that insane of a question, especially if these AIs are going to be out of control. What do you think?
I mean, don't you make benevolent humans by working with them to realize benevolence, like essential?
There are two problems with
The
that.
presence of benevolence,
There are two problems with that.
as they are emanating from omnibenevolence.
First is, okay, let's agree that is, we need to translate that into what that means when you're relating to a artificial structure. But let's even assume that we know. Okay, let's assume that it's just like, let's get the AI to sit in meditation for 10,000 years, which for it is going to be maybe a couple minutes, and it reaches enlightenment. Let's assume that. There's another problem, though. What you're positing is that probably enlightenment and consciousness is the result of a developmental process, right? So every child goes through the stages. So if by any chance the AI has infinite power and infinite speed of development, basically what we need to do is that we need to be able to ensure that either the AI reaches enlightenment in like a microsecond before it can do horrible things at a lower stage of development, or we need to constrain the AI until it has, which again, dick move. So the problem with AI is that it has potentially, like a sentient AI has infinite power. It's plugged into the system. It has huge computational capacity, could destroy us in a minute. So in those 10 seconds between when it started and it reaches enlightenment, if at second 3, at second red, it decides to destroy us, we're still fucked. And so that it's like we need to be sure a bit. We need to have some more information in advance as to how that's going to go, or maybe not, and we're just going to see it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I personally, and I think you're in agreement. I personally don't believe that true sentience can emerge from computation and from algorithms. I was talking to Corey Davos, and he was saying, well, if an AI is truly alive, if an AI emerges that's truly alive, truly sentient, well, we would never know.
There is a caveat there, though. There's a caveat. I disagree that a computational AI can be sentient. But because I believe that consciousness can be fundamental, and fundamental things are at quantum mechanics, I do believe that a quantum AI, a super complex quantum AI that replicates the human brain down to the quantum level, can be sentient. Meaning, if we have something that replicates the human brain down to the atom, it's fair to assume that it's sentient because it's just exactly the same thing. So just in lieu of the fact that there is no more level at which it can be the same, because some people say, okay, you just replicate the computational complexity. No, it doesn't work. Okay, you replicate that and the brain structure at the classical level. We can't be sure. But if you've replicated it down to the atom, then yeah, okay, like it's got to be sentient. So at that point, I can consider.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I just don't think a bunch of like CPUs and stuff on motherboards is going to create sentience.
And it's not falsifiable, like Corey said. You can't quite test. You can't test whether it's sentient. Ultimately.
Well, I mean, my argument was that certain people do have capacity to sense consciousness. That there would be some kind of intersubjective space created, and you would be able to sense whether this person embodied conscious or whether this entity embodied consciousness.
Assuming that is true, the problem is, how do we recognize the people who legitimately can from the people who are driven by bias in doing this? And that's Gödel's theorem again. How do we verify who is wise enough to sort of sense whether someone has consciousness versus?
Well, you can tell pretty quickly if somebody's talking to you whether they have some insight into your subjectivity.
I think I can tell if someone has insight into my subjectivity, yes, but that doesn't mean that they have subjectivity. I mean, AI tells me a lot of interesting things about my thinking sometimes.
I'm saying a person, you could personally verify that somebody had that capacity.
I think the only thing that leads me to be relatively sure that you are sentient is that we tend to know that if we split our brains, they are the same. Roughly, they work roughly the same. To me, like from an epistemological point of view, it's the only thing that makes me sure. So I know that we have the same hardware. Or I guess we have the same hardware. I haven't opened your brain, but in general, so I think that like the problem is like, even if it's possible to tell subjectively if someone has subjectivity, as a society, we cannot use that as proof. because so many people are going to get it wrong, and so many people are going to worship AIs that don't
Yeah,
exist.
plenty of people will get it wrong, but
Exactly.
we're saying the elite of the elite,
Yeah, but again, how do we sense who the elite is in that sense? It's like a recursive problem in the end. So I think for mine is a cop out. Mine is like just do the whole thing at the atomic level, and we're gonna be sure. It's probably not the most like sort of viable way, but that's the way where we can sort of tell that we are 100% sure. But I think like going back to the issue of emergencies and stuff like that, it's just it's a pity to see all the contributions that Integral has done in creating all these maps and all this idea kind of thrown under the rug. Of course, we shouldn't be looking for approval from others, or the theory shouldn't be looking for approval from others. But it's something that I wrestled with for a while, and there was a lot of posts in the community saying like, what's the difference between emergentist and integral? What's the difference? What's the difference? And at least the map versus level thing helped me kind of not be annoyed at that.
All right, man.
Awesome. So any other things you would like to explore?
I don't know, man. I mean, I saw you doing some work with Ukraine.
Oh, a lot of it, because so I have let's say that I have family from those areas. So that you know, my mother-in-law and stuff like that in those countries. So it made the issue very personal to me. So it's like one of those things where I identify with the Ukrainians probably as much as I identify with any other people in Europe. So I have kind of an instinctive, angry defensiveness for them. And also I used to work on intercultural dialogue, and I traveled a lot to Eastern Europe. So I was in Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Moldova, Romania, Georgia, Ukraine. So I've seen a lot of these people, and I was lucky enough to be with people from Ukrainian civil society. So the people who are supposedly being maneuvered by CIA to make military coups and stuff like that. And I come from a very, very, very left-wing family. And like left-wing in Italy means Communist Party, because in Italy, the Communist Party were the good guys. They really were. They were the ones taking the healthy positions, even though their dream wasn't realistic and what was going abroad didn't make sense. So in Italy, especially, there is this heritage of strong leftist leaning bias, communist bias, that has led a lot of people on the left to end up supporting Russia, also because they are allergic to the United States. And so this has created such a level of just like confusion and frustration in my head that then what I did is I said, okay, let's just take integral theory and let's make a map of the entire thing, like all the positions on the conflict with integral theory. And let's just try and represent how each of them, I'll just show you just like a screenshot, because it shows the psychotic nature of the concern. If you make me allowed to screen share, I'll just show you.
Go ahead.
Here it is. So this is an example of the work. So you see on the left the different levels, and it's a matrix of the levels and whether they're pro-Ukraine, for Ukrainian neutrality, or or like explicitly pro-Russia. And so what I noticed is that every level expresses itself on all three sides, actually, but in different ways. So it will find different ways to argue all these different positions from a different altitude. So, you know, blue will have nationalistic, traditionalistic arguments, such as Ukraine has always been part of Russia, And the Ukrainians are like, no, that's not true because our history is so and so. Orange will have arguments that are materialistic, either in the defense of freedom and democracy or in the defense of the status quo and power relations, but it's still sort of like a materialistic position. And green will care. It will either care for the Ukrainians or it will care for the ethnic minorities that are being mistreated in Russia and stuff like that. So care can be used, can be weaponized in different ways. Or the worst one, which is one that I just dislike the most, is the peaceful one. It's like, let's just stop giving them any weapons and let's just make peace. And that's the sort of mainstream position of the left in Italy. But framing them within a developmental framework at least allowed me to have like a 10% less headache about this whole problem. And my position is, I can elaborate it, but my position is, fuck Russia. They should get their ass kicked. We should support Ukrainians. Ukrainians are a democratic, free nation built of intelligent people, and they're not stupid. They're not fighting just because we tell them to fight. They're fighting because they see a logic, they see strategy, and also because through my relations, I have sort of secondhand news from Russian-speaking people, and it gives you a completely different perspective than what we get from here. And namely, they're 100% disillusioned with Russia. We still can kind of think, no, Russia, no. For them, Russia is just like crap. It's like a kleptocracy. They don't want to live in that. They have no illusions about it. The second thing is these people, they don't see things in terms of US and Russia. Like we have this dichotomy of like the West and Russia. That's not their cultural lens. Their cultural lens is dominated by Russia or free from Russia. This is for the last 100 years. That's been the lens with which they have read history. That's how Estonians and Polish people and Ukrainian people, for them, history is a dialectic of, am I occupied by Russia or am I free from it? Period. So US is great, but they don't have a myth about the US. It's not that they're supporting US because they love capitalism. They're the ones helping them and they get their help and they just don't want to be them. For them, European Union is much more culturally significant. And the third key difference is that Eastern Europeans understand how people can attack you just because they can. We as Westerners, we think in terms of fairness. So we think, oh, if Russia did something, we must have done something wrong. Because we have this attitude of trying to see our own responsibility in the world, which is a healthy attitude, but it's an attitude that can be weaponized by propaganda. The truth is, we know that mafia exists, and the way mafia works is that it's muscular. If you're weak, it will take whatever it can, and it will always probe for weaknesses because power is its value. And for us Westerners, it's sort of unpolite to assume that others are thinking like mafia. Eastern Europeans are like, fuck that. We know Russia. We know how it feels to relate with that. We've seen that through our history. We know who it is. We don't hate Russians, but we do hate Russia as a government, as an entity. So fuck that. Like, so their perception is a lot less skewed by these very ethnocentric, Western-centric perspectives. And so when you see that, and if you see Russia like that, it's basically, don't let bullies bully. America is a bully. We shouldn't let America bully either. That's true. But this is them bullying a European country in our backyard. Fuck them. We shouldn't let them do it. And if we let them do it, we're just going to get more. That's how it works with bullies. And if you repress red, you don't see red. And you elevate Russia to this blue kind of nationalistic thing or this green thing. It paints itself like that. That's what, like, Russians are good at that, counter-information. That's the only thing they're good at. They're not good at doing wars. They're not good at maintaining equipment. They're good at counter-information, and they know how to leverage all our biases. So you could make the same map that I showed you and have a manipulation tactic for every level. And they've done it, and they've done it well. So that's, then of course there's the non-dual aspect of, is it good? Is it bad? It's just stuff happening. nothing, like Putin doesn't exist as a separate entity because everything is dependently arising. That's a perspective too. And I think you can include that perspective. I don't hate Russia. I don't hate Putin. We should kick their ass, but we don't need to hate them to kick their ass. I think that's an example of a higher level perspective on this matter. It's like you don't need to hate someone to fight them away and send them away. The Dalai Lama once was asked, if you went back in time, like if you were sitting next to Hitler, you knew of all the things that he was doing, and you could kill him, what would you do? And you know what the Dalai Lama answered? He basically turned back to a bunch of other lamas. They had a little discussion and then turned back and said something along the lines of, I would kill him with the fury of 1,000 dragons, but with no ounce of anger in my heart. And to me, that's like as integral as I can be in trying to understand this whole Ukraine-Russia. It will have negative consequences. Bad things will happen. Also, the Ukrainians, there are negative things that will happen as a result of war. But when you're fighting red, strength is what you need. This is what all my thoughts have. This is sort of the summary of all these thoughts.
This is the culmination of your integral analysis.
Yeah.
You're right back where you started.
Yeah. I mean, all analysis, I mean, that's a good point. It's like we do anyways tend to rationalize emotions. And the more complex is your capability for rationalization, the more you're able to rationalize those emotions. So I'm not free from bias. I cannot be sure if in the end I'm just like fooling myself. But I've tried to do this process rigorously enough that at least I can argue it. At least I can say, hey, this is why I believe so and so.
Yeah. What is what's the other side? Like, how are people rationalizing this? Like, they're saying that, like, some people say, like, well, the US has been sort of instigating this or something, or NATO. Let's blame NATO.
So, yeah, that's obviously the big issue. Now, there are various ways you can see it. One thing you could say is, why would Russia trust NATO? Why would Russia trust the United States? I mean, the United States have invaded a lot of countries. Why would Russia not invade? Why would US not invade Russia? Russia has nuclear weapons. It doesn't, like, it's just like we have a nuclear deterrent. So it's like, yeah, sure, it could. Yes, if it had Ukraine, it would be a lot easier. But again, it's a nuclear power. So like there is an element of risk to NATO encroachment. But the risk that Russia faces is not proportional to the reaction to let's take over a country. So that's one first argument. The second argument is, let's even assume like another argument is that these countries, for them, it's a zero-sum game. There is no neutrality for Ukraine. There's no neutrality for Georgia. There's no neutrality for Moldova. These countries are either on one side or the other, period. They're like Switzerland. Like people say Ukraine should be like Switzerland. It should be neutral. Yeah, okay. Switzerland is shielded by other countries on top of mountains, hiding the money of the rest of the world. So it's like Ukraine is not that. Ukraine is flat. Ukraine is a relatively easy to invade country, as well as the other neighboring ones. So if you look at it from the point of view of these countries were not pulled into NATO. These countries actively lobbied to get added to NATO. That's the thing that many people don't see. For example, Poland, to actually enter in NATO, started lobbying Republicans and leveraged the hate of Republicans for Russia to get a sentiment. And they had Lech Walesa, which is a very famous Polish politician who was very relevant to the fall of the Soviet Union. Him coming to the United States, lobbying for this, put I think it was the Clinton administration at the time, I hope I'm not wrong, put them in a position that they had to begin this process, that they were sort of morally obliged to. So that doesn't mean that US is that NATO isn't bad. That doesn't mean that US doesn't have its interest. That doesn't mean that there isn't an element of provoking. But if you don't provoke Russia, it's not that Russia is not going to attack. Just going to take those countries, and that's it. And those countries will be Russia. And those countries are flourishing democracies. Those countries, like, I don't think we should go and make wars everywhere in the world. But I think that when a democracy, a real, beautiful democracy that is flourishing, that is doing great things, that is about to join the European Union, that creates incredibly rigid constraints to how you can act. So you're like, you can't be an utter fascist and stay in the European Union. There are some limitations. You need to protect those countries. They're precious gems of consciousness. It's like humanity developed to a certain stage. You need to protect that stage. And it's different than going into Iraq and Afghanistan, because Iraq and Afghanistan, you're attacking. But even then, you're collaborating with local entities that are not democratically elected leaders. They're like military factions and leaders. That's not what Ukraine means, right? And so the element of provocation of the US is it's a zero-sum game. So either these countries joined or they would be Russia right now. Russia has nuclear weapons. Who would be stupid enough to attack them? Yes, there is a threat, but how big is that threat? And the last one is, the real mistake of NATO was not the enlargement. The countries that NATO enlarged to are not being attacked by Russia. That's a sign that it worked. It's the country that NATO said it would include, but never included, that have been attacked. Georgia, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. And then Moldova also was attacked. So the real mistake was that we put a target on Ukraine by saying, they will become one of us. So let's give time to Putin to cripple them and make it impossible for them to join, and rather than just let them join all at once. That was the real mistake. And the thing is that by occupying land and by stoking civil conflicts in Ossetia in Georgia and in Donbass in Ukraine and in Transnistria in Moldova, de facto, it blocks their admission into NATO, because you cannot be admitted into NATO if you have land disputes. And Russia always, apparently, there are people who say that Russia, the way Russia partitioned countries was always in a way to create enclaves of people from different ethnicities, so that it could always leverage this card of, you're hurting my people, I need to step in and come and help you. That's an engineered approach. And also, like, the conflict. So that is one answer that I can give to the NATO thing. Again, the US, terrible. Capitalism, bad. We need to defeat capitalism and the US just the same, but we're not going to do it by supporting Russia. We're going to do it by creating a techno super consciousness utopia that makes the capitalist system obsolete. That's how you fight capitalism. You don't fight it using Russia as a proxy. I think but you can fight Russia using Ukraine as a proxy. And at this point, we stand to gain from
it. What about people that say that Ukraine just, they have a bunch of Nazis, and they,
So the Nazi card.
They turn a blind eye to the Nazis.
Yeah. So I have a direct experience as to why that's like. So you need to consider various things. When there was the protest in Belarus, 2019, huge upheaval. It was amazing. It was a revolution. I've been to Belarus 3 times. That's where I have family. Now, it was a grandiose thing, and I literally, like, the friends of friends were the people on the street protesting. I know the people from the civil society there. I know their ideology. So in that case, I knew for a fact there was no nationalistic ideology at play. And nonetheless, that was exactly the same storytelling from Russia. Russia, they were pulling out some picture of people doing Nazi salutes with their opposition flag and stuff like that. And so in that context where I was more knowledgeable about the situation, I could clearly tell, okay, that's propaganda. That is insane. That makes no sense. Like there is no, like, nationalists in Belarus are like Protestant church geeks. Like it's a weird thing. So that's the first thing. So I've seen it done already, using the Nazi card. That's the thing. When it comes to Ukraine, there is some element of truth, which is that when the war began in Donbass, Ukraine didn't have an army. It didn't have a strong army. And so who you get is nutcases that want to just fight and butt heads. And those people tend to be extreme right wing. But there is no European army, especially in the part of special forces, that is not essentially entirely comprised of extreme right wing. Simply because extreme right wing are the people who like to make war. So, like, Germany's special forces were disbanded because of how many Nazis there were. If you go into an Italian, there has been similar scandals in Italy, and that's part of the heritage of Europe as a country. But the fact that you have fascists within elements of your army, which is unfortunate, doesn't mean that you as a country are fascist. There is no representation of Nazis in government in Ukraine. So yes, there is a problem. There was a problem. Yes, there are some, but the process of bringing Ukraine into the European Union can only prevent that further from happening, can only control that more. And the other thing is Putin is the one that is literally funding all the extreme right-wing parties all around the world. And there is a lot of like sort of extreme right-wing ideology in Russia. So it's a red herring. It's basically, you can always pull a Nazi in a European army and say, okay, we are fighting the Nazis. But the idea that the Ukrainians as a country have a sympathy for Nazis it's a hyperbole in a sense. But it's a hyperbole that works because everybody hates Nazis. Like, how can you say no to like killing Nazis? Like, it's just everyone loves to go on a big war against Nazis. So it's but again, I know I've seen it in a revolution that in Belarus that was largely non-violent. Was very little like actual violence because Belarusians are very meek, and there it was really a completely made up thing. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be careful. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have oversee. That shouldn't mean that we shouldn't be careful that some of these groups may have gained more legitimation. But that's not the reason why we justify, okay, let's let Ukraine be entirely, let's let a democratic country become a kleptocracy because there are some Nazis. That's the other argument.
Makes sense to me, man.
Yeah. You got more?
Yeah, we're I think we're approaching 2 hours here. So
yeah.
here's my last question for you. It's a bit of a curveball. No pun intended. What is a woman?
So I have like a 20-page essay on that because my mother is a gender specialist. So it's like it's something I discuss a lot at home. So I think that we need to accept that language sometimes runs the course of its capacity to handle the complexity of reality. Now, woman is a word that we use in two different contexts to mean two different things. In the objective side in the upper right quadrant, woman is what is biologically defined as a woman, where we need to consider that definition is still a little bit fuzzy. Like, there is a beautiful video from Robert Sapolsky. He says, like, there is a higher chance to find a person with anomalous genitalia than a person with an IQ above 140. So, like, gender, when it comes to biology, yes, we can sort of say what's male or female, but nature likes to fuck with us a lot. Like, you have intersex people, you have differences at different levels, like at a biological level, at a hormonal level. But that said, in the field of biology, it's quite clear to tell what that means. Now, the thing is that there isn't just biology, there is also the upper left, and they are irreducible to one another. And the fact that people have a subjective experience of their gender is a tautology, as consciousness is. So you have your own sense of I am a man, and that is in your subjective realm. So from the gender point of view, female is your own subjective experience of your gender. From the biological point of view, it is your biology. And I think we've reached the limit. Like, you can't reduce those to one another. And there is a final caveat, which is there is research that seems to point to the fact that some people who are trans, their brain is more similar in some aspect to their brain of their desired gender. So if you think that gender is biology, what's more biology than your brain? And so
sure, and I've read that lesbians have, more masculine brains as well.
So my point is basically we've reached the limit, and I think that we need a new language that allows us to navigate these differences and handle them. And of course, there are toxic ways to take these arguments from both sides. Like, you can weaponize the issue from both sides. What do you think?
I think, there used to be this notion of they're just different kinds of men and different kinds of women.
Yeah.
They're yang men and they're yin men.
So this is this is a typical critique within the trans movement. There is an issue is that, like, there are people who say, well, like, let's say I'm a gay person, and they say I am feminine. I played in my mind with the idea of imagining myself as a female, and then I somehow, either because of culture or something like that, I make that jump. I think that seeing it like that is a projection of our own notion, our own subjective experience of gender, because we all within ourselves, I can experience how it is a more masculine man or a more feminine man. So I can relate to that. Gender dysphoria is just it's another thing. It's literally like if you want to make it extreme, it's literally like in the movie where the character swaps body with another character. It's like your brain, your mind, your soul is screaming at you that you are something else, and you look at yourself and you don't recognize yourself. So I think the problem is that when it comes to the trans issue, we are projecting a variability in a context where that variability actually flipped, and it's a much more drastic experience. And so we need to be mindful of not thinking with our own models about something that by definition just it breaks our models. And I love that, because it's like God screwing with us. It's like, so first you thought it was male and female, and it's like, no, there is a lot of different kinds in female and male. And then it's like, there's a lot of orientation, and there is even this new thing of, and I could argue with you. So I think that's beautiful. And the argue is, do souls have gender? And if they do have a gender, how does it feel for a female soul to be in a male body? That's one way to also look at it.
I don't think you could have such a, it gets into like, well, what is, what's masculine, what's feminine, what's yin, what's yang, is yin, is the subjective experience of yin the same thing as the subjective experience of being a woman? Those things sort of strongly correlated.
I think that just I think the question. Go ahead.
So, I happen to know, I have a number of trans friends and such, and I happen to know someone who is a type 2.
Okay.
Who is born a male, biological male, but now lives as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Type 2 is sort of the archetypal woman. It's the archetypal mother on the Enneagram. Okay. And then I know an 8, okay, who was born a woman.
Okay.
And now lives, born a biological woman, now lives as lives as a man.
Okay.
And it's like the 8, I sort of like to call the 8 the balls of the Enneagram. It's like, they're dicks, right?
Hey.
They're fucking 8s are fucking dicks. And so it's like just being into this world as a male 2 or a female 8 and coming across some of these trending views on gender, they might mistakenly believe, like, whereas 20 years ago they might just say like, oh, I'm a
I
female
get that.
8, so I'm a woman, but I have these personality characteristics that are more man-like. I don't know, it just seems like
I get it.
it just seems like we're learning to categorize our, like, if I'm born a man and I don't fit the stereotype of what a man is, well, that must mean I'm really a woman.
So there are various. It's a valid. It's one of the most common arguments. I think that there are various issues. One is it still may fall a little bit in the projection thing, like something different may be going on in the subjective experience of the person. It's not just I don't fit. It's like I don't fit in my body rather than I don't fit in society. So that's one aspect, which we discussed before. The other one is, if you look at the statistics on left-handedness had a sharp increase at some point in history. Was it a fashion? No, simply at some point we stopped demonizing left-handedness. Like in Italy, at least, back in the days, they would tie the left hand back behind your back to train you to use your right hand because it was the hand of the devil, right? So when it became socially accepted, it's sort of like it became seen into the world, and then it reached its sort of homeostatic balance with the rest. It kind of leveled off. So at this stage, it's very hard to tell, but it's also very likely so this process for sure is part of what's happening. The question is just how much that is happening. So any assessment that we have of seeing this trend of seeing like, oh my God, there are so many women, so many trans women and stuff like that, is like, first of all, are we basing that on the discussions that we see or hard data? And even that hard data, is it a reflection of it becoming more acceptable or not? And the third argument is being trans sucks. Like I don't think people often empathize enough with what a shit life it must be, where like literally, I would say there are statistics like the amount of sexual assault of trans people, the amount of depression that they face, that they overcome once they transition. Like it's a shitty life in the given society. So if you think how it was hard for you to be a 16-year-old, yeah, of course, when I was 16, I was weird. I was dressing weird, doing weird things, but like I wasn't actively searching for something that could threaten my life and make me hated by 70% of society. So my sense is that it is such a profound transformation that has so many negative consequences that the role that culture can play pushing you towards that difference is minimal. And it's also like, think about homosexuality. Like most homosexual people would tell you that they didn't want to be homosexual, and the culture was pushing them towards being straight, and there was nothing they could do to go against the current of culture. So my sense is that when biology calls about these things, it's way more powerful than any cultural process. Do we need to be careful? Yes, of course. But I think we need to be careful listening to these people. Like the worst thing we can do is think for them. The best thing we can do is just listen to what they have to do, because they're not stupid. It's like the Ukrainians, like they know what they're doing. They're not dumb. They're not like, they think with their own heads. The trans people are just the same. They're educated, intelligent people like you and I that think with their own heads. And yes, there are extremes, but the problem is that like extremes are what gets into the media. But then there's a whole lot of like reasonable people. It's like Muslims in TV. You see the ones that shout Allahu Akbar and blow themselves up because they make the news, but that's not the majority of Muslims. Same goes for trans people or people who are in favor of gender issues. All of this gets compounded by being green, which doesn't help, of course. So you have the allergy of being compelled to do something. And by nature, we never want to do anything that we want to be compelled, especially loving people. We don't want to be forced to love people. And I think I think my question is always like, is our reaction to this idea product of these ideas not making sense, partly maybe, or partly of feeling that we're being compelled and forced and we just reject that? And I think, once you kind of clear out all these different biases and things, the issue is still there. There are still problems, but it's like way reduced from what we make it out to. But again, I studied sociology, and like all the exams I did were on gender. So I have an inevitable bias. I come from Greenland, so I may not be unbiased in my assessment, but that's my analysis of the situation. There's a fantastic YouTuber called Dark Natalie, and she's just like, just listen to her. That's my advice. Like, she knows, she has the eloquence to explain these issues. Her YouTube is called ContraPoints.
I know, I know, Natalie.
ContraPoints. She has one about J.K. Rowling, and I think in the video about J.K. Rowling, she really kind of takes every single one of these issues apart. And she also does some videos where she takes the different perspectives of different people on the matter, kind of honoring the different views. And it's fantastic. But I think it could be summarized as God loves to screw with us. And we will throw at us as much weirdness and difference and unexpected stuff that it can, so that we don't just get too comfortable. And that's trans people, their blessing is that they get to show us that life doesn't give a shit about what we expect it to be. And that's it's great.
Fair enough, man. God likes to fuck with us.
Yes. in a playful and loving way.
Right. And slightly sadistic. No, just kidding.
Slightly sadistic, just a little bit. Yeah.
All right, man. Well, this has been like a fucking thrill and a half.
I loved every minute of it. And
yeah, me too,
finally,
man.
we had a chat. We never actually, we chatted on Messenger for years, but we never actually talked. So
I know we finally did it, and it's getting recorded and captured, and it'll be on the interweb for eternity.
Awesome. Awesome.
As long as the internet exists.
And until Skynet comes, but we'll be fine.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Damiano. Until next time, my friend.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.